sophomore here at the College of Wooster. I'm going to be your host and moderator for the evening. This is a panel on living wages at the College of Wooster. We have several distinguished panelists. But first, I wanted to get a quick word about our organization, the Living Wage Campaign, from our president and VP, co-presidents, excuse me, Claire Weineman and Margarita Dyer.
Hello, we are the co-presidents of the Living Wage Campaign, and I consider you all part of the Living Wage Campaign as well. So thank you for being here and for coming to the event and being engaged in this conversation. We've been here for about 5 years, 4 years officially as a chartered group. You know us from other events on this campus, perhaps most relevantly our fall demonstration. This panel is sort of a follow-up to that, continued discussion of living wages on this campus and what maybe some of the barriers to having a living wage on this campus might be. I think that's really just pretty much all we wanted to say. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists for being here and making this such a fantastic opportunity for us to engage as a community about this issue. All right.
So I want to introduce our 6 panelists here. We have the president of the College of Wooster, Sarah Bolton. We have our VP of Business and Finance, Charles Ingram. Our VP of Advancement, Wayne Webster. A student who is the former president of SGA and former board member and BSA, Monet Davis. Chair of the Department of Economics, Dr. Amias Moladina, and Professor of Sociology, Dr. Tom Tierney. So the way this is, a round of applause for our panelists. So the way this is going to work, we're going to let each panelist give just a brief introduction to who they are and their background involving the topic of living wages, and then some opening statements from each panelist, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. We're going to have our microphone runner, Mary Kate, and she's going to be passing the mic among audience members, so I'm sure all of you have plenty of questions for these people, but we're now going to move into introductions and opening statements.
Do you want us to do introductions all the way down? Yeah, and then that's all of them. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, just about who you are. Is it on?
Hi, I'm Sarah Bolton here. I'm the president, and I'm really, really glad to be in this conversation with everyone. I'm looking forward to it.
Hi, I'm Charles Ingram. I'm the vice president for business and finance. I'm interim, so I get to say what I want, because you can't fire me.
Wayne Webster, vice president for advancement. As you'll see later on, I oversee fundraising and alumni and parent engagement at the college, so I'm part of the revenue model at the college, my team.
I'm Monet Davis. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior. I'm the former president of the Student Government Association and a former board member. However, any views that I'm sharing right now are solely my own. And I know that many of you all here have participated in demonstrations or other sort of events hosted by Living Wage. So I'm also a student supporter.
My name is Amias Moladina. As Gabe said, I'm the chair of the economics department. I'm an economist.
Tom Tierney in the sociology department. I'm also chair of the Strategic Planning and Priorities Advisory Committee, which advises President Bolton on budgetary matters and other issues. So I'm really excited to hear the comments and questions from the audience. But I'd also like to thank the Living Wage Campaign for its work over the past several years. I've known less than 3 generations of students, and the work you've done is sort of heading the college in the right direction to keep the pressure on is appreciated.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a moment then and just say a little bit about the principles from which we work as we're thinking about how to use the resources of the college to the best purpose, which is in some ways, that's my job, right? The resources of the college come to us from students, present students, and from past students, in particular from alumni who give to the college. And my job, all of our job together, but my job in particular, is to find the best way to use those resources for everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those principles and a little bit about the practicalities. Where do those resources come from? What are they called on to do? And how do we make those decisions? So can folks hear me okay? Okay, so I have a few figures. Hopefully they're visible. So I wanted to start by just talking about principles. Where do we start before we start moving any numbers around or making any kind of decisions? So the first priority for us is that we're here to be a college. We want Wooster to be a great place for our students, a great place to live, a great place to learn, a great place to study, a great place to grow. And we know that in order to have that happen, we need wonderful staff and faculty. It's the wonderful staff and faculty that provide that living and learning experience for students and make this the place that hopefully you have had a good experience being and will grow from and go out into the world and do great things. We also want this to be a great place for our staff and our faculty to work. We want this to be a place that has a good working environment, a welcoming working environment, a fair working environment, an environment where people can grow professionally and develop, and also one that has appropriate compensation, where we're compensating people fairly for their work. And that means having a fair salary, it means having health insurance and retirement and the other kind of benefits that people rely on in order to support their work both while they're working, when they may need to be out sick, or when they retire. So those are some of the things that come together. And then as a third principle, we need the college to be affordable and accessible for students, right? Because one of the things that we don't want to do is make the place ever more expensive. I know it's very expensive to go to college, but we need to pay attention to, for example, providing the financial aid that makes it possible for students to be here. So as you'll see in a minute, those three goals, they come together to inform a bunch of the decisions that we have to make, the challenging decisions and important decisions that we have to make every year about how we use our resources. So let me talk about that a little bit more in specific. Is it okay if I stand up and point at things? Okay, because I know that the letters are a little bit hard to read. So this is just a big picture of where our resources come from that we use to do everything we do at the college. So this big yellow piece over here, if you can't see the letters in the back, comes from tuition, the tuition that current students bring us. And that says net tuition because that's the original tuition if you paid the sticker price minus the financial aid that we bring. So that's about $40 million altogether. This is auxiliaries, so that's a lot of the things that happen in this building, dining, the bookstore, but also so room costs, room and board are in there. And then up here in the pink and these other colors are the things that come from other places, particularly from gifts. So this pink piece here, the biggest one, that's endowment draw. So you might have heard of the Wooster's Promise campaign. That was one of the things that we did to do fundraising from our alumni who generously give us funds every year. And the endowment is a set of investments. It's gifts that people give us for particular purposes. So a lot of that endowment is given specifically for scholarships. And if someone gives it to us for scholarships, we have to use it for scholarships. And it's an investment of which we're only allowed to spend the interest. So that means we can spend 5% every year of that total endowment, and that's what this money is, that we can spend each year, 5% of the endowment. Then we get some gifts that we are given to spend each year. That's the Wooster Fund, about $3 million a year, and then some grants and other small slices of the pie. But it's important to see here that the biggest piece of the pie is tuition, and then auxiliaries, of which a fair fraction is room and board. So there's a lot here that comes from students. So that's why it's really important that we're having this conversation, and it's also why it's really important as we're thinking about the resources we have when we say we want to make the place accessible and affordable, right? The more that we're trying to make it accessible and affordable, the more that can shrink this pie, and that's okay because we want people to be able to come here, but there's a balance there we need to think about. So this is giving you a little bit of a sense of the trends. So I know as students you're aware that every year tuition and room and board become more expensive. And so it's very natural that you would think that every year we would have more resources to spend, right? That would make sense. Your bill goes up, so we must have more resources to spend. But that's actually not true. So this down here, this line is the total amount of net tuition revenue that we had in 2017, 2018, and this year, 2019. So I don't know if you can see the numbers, but here, this number starts as $41 million and something. That's fiscal 17. This is $39 million and something, so less in fiscal 18, and then back up to 40 in fiscal 19. But essentially, this is flat. Okay, and the reason it's flat, the reason it doesn't go up, even though tuition and fees definitely go up, is because financial aid goes up faster. Okay, so this is a plot of all of the financial aid that's being given across all 4 classes to students, and you can see that this starts in 2009, goes to 2019. You can see it goes up quite fast. So last year, $54 million. This year, $58.6 million. And that's really important. That's part of our critical commitment to try to make it as possible as it can be for students with all different kinds of family resources to be able to have their education here at Wooster. But if the number of the financial aid goes up quickly, that means that we get into that situation where the resources of the college are pretty constant over time. So this is a bigger picture, again, from 2006 to 2019 of the total resources of the college. This is the piece from net tuition, from auxiliaries, and then these are the various kinds of gifts on the top. And if you just focus on those last 4 years, I sort of grayed out the past. So for those of you who are seniors, these would be the 4 years you've been here. What you can see is that the total amount of resources that we have, it goes up and down a little bit, but it's not going up in any kind of consistent way. And that's what we expect for next year as well, that we'll be, again, pretty much with those constant resources. So that tells you a little bit about the funds that we have. Now I'll just give you a couple slides to tell you how we expend those resources. And the most important thing to know about the way Wooster spends money, and colleges in general spend money, is a large fraction of what we spend it on is for salary and benefits, for compensation. So this is the whole pie of what we spend our resources on. 71% is for salary and benefits for everybody, faculty and staff, and actually student employees as well. Then this slice here is really everything else we do for non-compensation. So all the things we buy, all the gas we use to drive vehicles, all those kinds of things is in there. This little slice is utilities. These are things that have to do with buildings. This has to do with when we take a mortgage or take out debt to build something. That comes in there. But so that the large fraction there is for people. So here's our challenge. Our total resources are not increasing. I think that's really important to realize. Our total resources that we have to spend every year are not currently increasing from one year to the next. But every year, certain kinds of costs increase in ways that we can't control. So I have just one example here. Health insurance costs paid by the college. Over 2 years, those health insurance costs went up by $1 million. But the amount of money we had didn't go up by $1 million. So we have to figure out these challenging decisions. What do we do? How do we make it possible to give raises, for example, appropriate cost of living raises for all of our staff and all of our faculty when the total amount of money that we have is flat? That means that every year we have to make hard decisions. We're going to have to find some things that we can do less of just in order to give raises, even if we don't do any of the other things like add new positions, for example, that students and others often advocate for very sensibly, say we need more or more of a certain kind of service or more positions. But we have the same amount of money, so if we're going to give raises, we have to figure out how that happens year over year. So I want to just say 2 words about the budget process, just to finish up. So how do we figure out what decisions we're going to make? So Dr. Tierney talked a little bit about the strategic planning committee. That's one of the places we think about how are we going to make these challenging decisions. We also talk about it in cabinet, of whom these folks are part of our cabinet. Ultimately, the Board of Trustees votes our budgets. And I know the Living Wage Campaign has had fruitful interactions with the board as well. And that's a complicated question. Who's really in charge, right? I know who's responsible. And the answer is we're responsible as a collective. Your voices matter. All of these people's voices matter. Ultimately, the board votes, but they vote a budget that we bring to them and discuss with them and put together. So we all have a part of that. So I want to just say a couple things to give you a final understanding of kind of how we've made these decisions. So these are some things for the budget in this current year. We talked about priorities being student safety and well-being, responding to information in the retention study. So we made for some investments, for example, around counseling. I think this week was the first week for a long time that there's been zero wait list at the counseling center. So there's some investments that you see there playing through. We focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion for this current year. That included bringing the college's first chief diversity officer, a new investment. And then we focused on staff and faculty equitable compensation, and that had a particular form this year. We had done a study of the compensation of all staff and had found that there were quite a few staff whose salaries were lower than they should be relative to other people doing the same work in different places. And so we prioritized our raises to kind of bring those staff compensation levels up. So again, when we're thinking about setting salaries, I know one of the questions was how do you make decisions about what salaries should be? Again, we want Wooster to be a good place to work as well as a good place to learn, so to provide the things that students want and need, and also to provide the compensation that staff and faculty need. And we need, as we're thinking about folks in different kinds of positions, to offer salaries that are at least in the range of what a similar job would offer elsewhere, because that's how we bring great people to the college. People want to work at the college because students are wonderful to work with. But if we pay much less for a particular job, let's say for that chief diversity officer job, if we were offering much less than another college was, it would be hard for a person to accept our offer. And so that's one of the things that we think about as we're hiring for different roles. So I'll just say the last thing. So for next year, we're putting together right now, just today we had a conversation in SPAC about the budget for next year. We haven't yet figured out how to make a balanced budget for next year, but we will because the board requires it. Because again, we have that flat amount of resources. We want to give raises to everybody. We're trying to figure out where can we shrink in order to make a balanced budget and still give those raises. So these are some of the priorities that we're talking about. One of them is, in fact, raising the lowest wage. That's a priority in this year's budget that we've been trying to think about. How much can we do that? How fast can we do that? Cost of living increases for all of our staff and faculty. Because the cost of living increases, we want to be able to compensate for that in people's compensation. And then thinking about other matters, obviously, to do with the student experience. So that's a little bit about the background. That's all I have to set the stage.
Thank you for those opening statements. So do we have opening statements from either of the other two cabinet members, or can we move on to... Okay, so an opening statement from Monet.
So I don't have a presentation or anything, but I just wanted to get a gauge of students' interest in living wage. So raise your hand if you attended the demonstration that occurred this past fall. And then raise your other hand if you know someone who wasn't able to make it today to this panel, but also attended. Okay, put your hands down. Now raise your hand if you've been to a staff appreciation event. And raise your hand if you know someone else who can't make it to this panel, but also has attended one. Great, put your hands down. Raise your hand if you talked to a staff member and you've learned so much about them and their experiences, or if you've written a letter to the Board of Trustees or President Bolton, and you feel like your experiences here at Wooster wouldn't be the same if it wasn't for the hourly paid staff members here at Wooster. So I think we can all say that it's fair to say that our hourly paid staff members are such a fundamental part of Wooster, and I can say that for myself for sure. And I know many students feel conflicted with being part of a community that doesn't necessarily take care of every single member the way that they should. So I can't spit out numbers or anything like that, but I think that students are very passionate about this, and our voices are very important, as President Bolton has said. So that's all I really have, but students really care, and if we're part of a community, we need to make sure that everyone is thriving and living in the fullest capacity that they can, and it's impossible for staff members to do so if they can't afford groceries or childcare or pay their rent, and they have to work multiple jobs and survive off of very few hours and lots of coffee. That's not an equitable or successful community. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Monet. Dr. Melodina?
So I have some research that I wanted to share, but I don't know if you want to hear all of it, because there's quite a bit of it. So for those of you that are interested, I have a Zotero account, and you can go and you can read all the literature on living wage and compensation. So I'll just highlight a few things. The first thing is that from a market perspective, and if you think about living wage campaigns, they've been implemented at the municipal level or at the city level in various places in the United States. And a lot of the economists that have looked at that research, the stereotypical sort of model that you learn in principles of econ is that when you pay a living wage or a minimum wage, that it creates unemployment. And there hasn't been any conclusive evidence to show that at the municipal level or at the city level, there is unemployment. So there's no empirical evidence to back up that play model that we teach in Principles of Econ. Got that? Okay, so that's the first piece of research. The second piece of research is kind of more firm level, and that's sort of, like when we're making a decision, we're a firm. And so the question is, do firms go under as a result of, paying a living wage and so on and so forth. And here, you have to think about the caliber of economists that study this, okay? So Janet Yellen is one of them. Anyone know who Janet Yellen is? Who is she? She's the first female chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, right, of the United States. So she was in charge of monetary policy. Akerlof, anyone know who Akerlof is? Won the Nobel Prize. Stiglitz, anyone know who Stiglitz is? Also won the Nobel Prize. Okay, so there's some very serious economists that are thinking about this. Okay, so they're thinking about the story from the firm level. So one of the first sort of very simple theories out there is that when you pay the equilibrium wage, which is the market wage, you pay what everybody else pays, there are some really interesting firm level things that occur. Because you cannot distinguish between good workers and bad workers, typically when you pay the market wage, in your labor pool, you have both. Okay, so firms actually have an incentive to pay above market wages to attract the most productive workers. That's called the efficiency wage theory. We teach it in labor economics, and we also teach it in macroeconomics. So then there's other research by Yellen and Akerlof and so on and so forth that talk about or think about firms that pay more than the market as a gift exchange kind of story. So the idea is that as a firm, if you give this gift to your workers, the workers give the gift back to you in terms of higher productivity, more allegiance to the cause, if you will, if they stick around for longer periods of time, and so on and so forth. So all this research basically is showing that, both theoretical and empirical, that at the firm level, if you pay wages that are higher than the equilibrium wage, higher than what everybody else pays, you get these remarkable productivity effects. From the workers' perspective, workers actually start to invest in their own health. They live healthier lives. as a result. So they make actually very responsible choices as a result of getting that higher equilibrium wage. So there's research that shows that productivity improves. There's research that shows turnover decreases. So that's actually where we get into Wooster a little bit more. The College of Wooster is one of the largest employers in our city. So that means it's a monopsony. We have market power. We set the wage, so to speak. We don't take the wage that others give us. If you think about the College of Wooster as a monopsony, then if a monopsony is not paying efficiency wages, you would expect to see high labor turnover. And so we haven't done a study on the College of Wooster, but kind of you're seeing some very quintessential signs, if you will, that that's the case. So one idea of sort of, the money has to come from somewhere, right? I mean, nothing is free, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. I'm sure you've heard that. Okay, so where do these funds come from? Well, so if your workers are more productive, i.e., maybe there's more revenue potential from other kinds of enterprises that they could imagine, for example. The other thing, though, that's very real is that when you have very high turnovers, you have high search costs. And search costs sometimes may be explicit or implicit. So either they're explicit funds that you're paying out of your budget, or they weigh on the minds of your managers. Okay? They have to constantly retrain new workers and so on and so forth. And that also then results in subsequent turnovers. So you have this really kind of interesting effects in terms of these hidden costs and these actual explicit costs that if you pay lower than equilibrium wages, you have to bear as an institution. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Professor Tooney?
I don't have anything to add. I'm kind of anxious to hear some questions, so I'll just...
Great. So the way questions are going to work, anybody can just raise their hand from the audience. We're going to have our mic runner, Mary Kate. Questions can be for the entire panel, and anybody on the panel can take a stab at it if they want, or they can be directed at one specific member or at the cabinet. So it's really up to you, whoever you want to ask your question to. Do we have any questions from the audience to start?
You're behind the pillar. Yeah.
You can introduce yourself if you want.
Hello, my name is Galen. I have a question for Professor Bolton, or President Bolton, excuse me. I believe you're also a professor. You have showed that very cute little pie graph of where the money goes, and that very large slice going to compensation, salaries, and wages. Could you break down that slice a little more? How much of that's going to academic faculty? How much of that's going to non-academic faculty? How much of that is going to hourly staff? How much of that is going to you? Can you break that down for us a bit?
I don't think I have all the numbers, but let's see. So of that 60, about 58 million, this is the picture you're talking about, right, Galen?
Yes, that's correct.
So of the $60 million here, $58 million, about 2/3 of that is salary and about 1/3 is benefits, just to start with that. So so the salary line is kind of here. This part is salary and this part is benefits. I'm trying to remember. Oh, Charles is looking up the answers to your questions, so we might have to postpone them for a minute. I believe that, I'm not going to get it right. I think that the faculty is about, I don't know about the top of my head. I think the faculty is about 15 million. We'll tell you what, he's going to look up all the numbers, and then we will produce that information for you.
All right,
He's
sounds
got his
good.
computer live right now.
We have another question.
While we're waiting for those numbers, would you all mind taking another question?
Not at all.
Hello, My name is Lily, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs. So I'm wondering, and this is for anyone, if you do implement a living wage, I happen to work at Lowry, not very many hours, but basically there's staff that have worked here for like a really long time, like 10 years or more, 20 years or more, you name it, like very long times that they've started at the minimum wage and they've gradually earned raises. And a lot of staff, I feel, are frustrated that they feel like if the wage is raised to, I forget the actual number, but basically they feel like they'll lose all that hard work that they did for all those many years because they'll just get the same wage as everyone else, like any person who's just started.
Yeah,
so,
thank you for that question. And that's one of the things, if you look at the document that the Living Wage Campaign helpfully did a lot of calculations, which we have also done some calculations. And when you think about what would we need to invest to raise the wage in any way, right? Whether raise it part of the way there or all of the way there, part of the cost is that if as you said, if someone had worked here a long time and had been gradually accumulating wages, or between the current lowest wage for full-time workers, which is $11 an hour, and the amount calculated by the Living Wage Campaign, which is $14.08, I believe. There are people with varying different jobs and different responsibilities, and some of them have been promoted from a starting job into a higher job, and those promotions have also earned an increase in wage. Some may be supervisors or mentors to newer people. And so whenever you make a shift like that, you need to both raise the lowest wage and make some adjustments so that if they're, let's say if you're going from 11 to 12, there are all different wages in there, and then you need to, the people who are at $11.99 should not probably just end up at 12. Right? So there are different levels of responsibility and different experiences. So you call that decompression. You don't want the wages to all collapse for a whole bunch of different roles onto a single point. So that we have to take that into account. So when Living Wage did their calculation, they showed 3 different models of ways that you could try to manage or appropriately distribute wages that had been distributed below that living level. And now, Mr. Ingram will answer your question, Galen.
All right, faculty, 15,200,000, salaried staff, 13 million, hourly staff, 10,135,000, students, 1.765 million.
We have another question over here.
So throughout this conversation, we've had a lot of different types of wages discussed. So some of the adjectives we've used are fair wages, equitable wages, market average wages. I don't think we've talked a whole lot about minimum wages and the idea of the living wage. So I was wondering if we could sort of define what we mean by fair or equitable wages. I think we know sort of living wages, the absolute fair to cover, basic standard of living, shelter, food, water, childcare, that type of thing. And the market average is sort of, it depends on the market that you define, right? But I'd like to know what you, President Bolton, mean when you talk about fair or equitable wages, especially in the emails to the student body and such.
Absolutely, thank you. So I'll say a couple of things, because I think you're right that these words can mean very different things, and you're right, the living wage is calculated from a particular set of data, MIT data, and some assumptions about family size and structure and the number of wage earners in a family, as I understand it. The minimum wage is set by governments, right? So that just comes in as a number, essentially always lower than that living wage. What people think is fair and how they understand fair compensation, I think actually varies a lot. There are economic models that people hear to that have the principle that everyone who's working hard full time, everyone should be paid the same, regardless of their role. That's one kind of kind of a communist model, right? Everyone according to their needs and abilities. Then there are models that are purely market-based that say, whatever the lowest amount that we could get someone to do this job for, that's what we should pay them, right? And all the other models are somehow, this is probably not a proper economic description, but every other model is somewhere in between there, right? Some kind of mix of principles and markets. So I'll say a little bit about how I think about this. I would really like us to be able to pay a living wage to everybody. I would like us to be able to pay what people need to get by. I think that when people talk about equitable wages, they don't just mean that either, right? Someone mentioned earlier people having been here for a long time and earning more over time. I think that's a principle that folks have often if they've been in a job for a while, or if they have increasing levels of responsibility and authority and things that they're responsible for the guidance and supervision of others, that they also expect and anticipate some raises for those kinds of increasing levels of responsibility. People also anticipate sometimes that their wages will go up if they're expected to respond over any time 24/7, 365 versus being able to set their job down when they go home. So there are different kinds of ways that people think about equity. I think people also think about equity within an institution. So when we did this study last year about sort of staff wages and what that was an equitable wage study, and we looked at two kinds of equity. So within the institution at the college, if you had two people who had done similar job for a similar period of time, were they being paid the same or were there some gaps? So that was one of the things that we prioritized last year, was to try to fix places where that seemed not to be the case, internal equity. And then external equity, so if you were to leave the college and go do a similar job somewhere else, were we paying you a fair wage for that job compared to what you would make to do that job elsewhere? So I think that the words around equity and fairness are in there. The other thing that I think people take into account in fairness gets back to this question of being a good place to work in terms of having a good work environment. So people talk to me sometimes about whether they feel they're being fairly evaluated by their manager or supervisor. Are they being fairly treated and compensated? Is that person looking out for equity within that area? So that's those words, you're right, they have many, many meanings. But those are the things that I would offer.
Do you have any? No? Yeah.
I just got one question, really. Going through that answer, it kind of seemed like there was a little bit of a diversion from what the actual question was. So I was just wondering, in the clearest terms possible, what would you define as a fair wage and what would you define as an equitable wage?
So I think I use those two words interchangeably. They mean the same thing to me. And they mean that there's different kinds of fairness that I was talking about in terms of fairness for doing the same job across the institution and fairness inside and outside. So those are the two things that I talk about. And then the other thing I said at the beginning was that I would like for us to be able to pay a living wage to everyone who's here. And so that's a separate statement.
Yeah, we have another question for that.
Earlier in your presentation, when you had the slide with the net resources over time, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you've kind of described as a stagnation in the last 4 years and why that upward trend did not continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'll say two things. So there's two pieces to this. The biggest one is financial aid, because the biggest proportion of our resources comes here from tuition, and this is the total tuition. So if everyone paid the sticker price minus the total financial aid, right? So as financial aid goes up faster than tuition, that is the major effect, and you can see it. This is the black lines are the tuition. And so you might be wondering, well, is that somehow because Wooster has fewer students now, somehow? That's not the case. We actually have about 25 more students this year than we did last year. So it's not that we're somehow losing students, it's actually that the average financial aid per student has increased because we're trying to make the college accessible to folks. And at least for a while, wages were flat, so that nationally. So that's a big piece of it. There are a couple of other components, though, that I might just mention. One has to do with our endowment. As I said, the intention when people give us funds for the endowment is that the principal will be there in perpetuity and we're only allowed to spend the interest. We have been intentionally making sure that that's true, and that's meant spending a little bit smaller fraction of the endowment than we had been in the past. We had been spending up a little bit towards 6%. The growth in the markets is not enough to make that really a sustainable thing. So we've actually been spending a smaller and smaller percentage. We've worked with the board to figure out what we should be doing there. So although the endowment has been growing a little bit, the amount we can draw from it has been shrinking. So that's another component of that flatness. Thank you.
Any questions?
Just wanted a really quick follow-up to the financial aid commentary. I'm curious, is that financial aid including exclusively demonstrated need, or does it also include merit aid? I'm curious if there's more merit aid now to try and attract stronger students, perhaps, from places that they wouldn't normally be coming from. Just curious about that.
Yeah, so this includes both need and merit aid. So it's all of the scholarships that are given by the college. Yeah, and I would say that nationally, so that's need-based and merit-based. I think many students would say that their merit scholarships are actually needed by their families in order for them to come here. So there's a technical definition and a probably lived experience definition of students as well. Nationally, the trends that we see here in terms of the aid that we need to offer are similar in other institutions as well. So it's not a particular strategy to get students, better students. We have excellent students. We've always had excellent students. So that's not the intention.
Chuck Kammer, another way to think about equitable or fair wage has to do with looking at ratios. So in the corporate world, and Dr. Moldina probably figures better than I, it looks like something around 365 to 1 compensation for chief CEOs compared to average worker. And so when you're doing that, you're making a value statement that the CEOs worth 365 regular workers. So I wonder if you could talk about fair compensation in terms of relationship to the highest or lowest paid. What would be a fair ratio?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say that we haven't talked about when we talk among the about equitable compensation. We tend to talk more about comparison with our peers in terms of hiring people in similar roles than we do in terms of ratios. Although it's a perfectly good way to talk about it. I think partly because we're thinking about trying to draw somebody, let's say, to a provost role who do a great job of leading the academic program and make it a great place for faculty and students to be. We're thinking more about how do we pay something that would be equitable to that individual relative to other places they could have that job. So we haven't done all of the ratios in that way, although one certainly could. Not the way we usually work.
Do you have any more questions from here?
So one of the graduate qualities that is a part of being a Wooster student and a Wooster alumni is civic engagement, and a part of that is being actively involved in creating an equitable situation in our college and in the world. And I think that a lot of us are feeling somewhat frustrated and confused about how we can say that we represent these kind of ideals and then we don't see it played out in actuality in our own institution. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit for us.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that. I'll say two things, which is, one is that you're absolutely right. That is one of our graduate qualities. And it's one that I see expressed in this room and in the protests in October and in many, many conversations with students and staff and faculty. And it is a really important thing about our community. And I talk to presidents at other places about the ways that students here advocate for one another and for staff in important ways. And It's not common everywhere. You know, people say, "What, your students are standing up for that?" I wish our students would stand up for that. And I say, yeah, right. Our students are standing up for what's right. It's a really important commitment, and I think it is a reflection of our graduate qualities. And I appreciate your frustration and you're raising your voice about it. You know, what I would say, and I get that this is probably not going to be satisfying, but is that what we're trying to do is move in the right direction over time, right? We can't, we don't, at least I haven't figured out a way to go all the way from here to the place we'd like to be all at once. And for me, my obligation is to sort of, to do two things, right? One is to try to make the pie bigger, somehow responsibly in a way that doesn't overtax students, right? To make the pie bigger so that we can move forward more rapidly. And the other is to try to prioritize within the resources we do have as best as we can to gradually make some progress. And so, and I get that doesn't feel fast enough in a certain way, but if you sort of look over the past 4 years, the years in which those revenues have been flat, there have been 4 things that have happened, well, maybe 3, but the first was a raise from the $9 to $11 lowest wage, which really needed to happen. That happened in 2016, so at the beginning of that period. Then there was a progressive change in the health insurance, which shifted the health insurance costs so that it was a percentage of salary rather than a flat amount. That's very unusual. None of our peers did that, and that was something that actually staff and faculty in the strategic planning group worked on, so that if you have a lower wage, you pay less costs for the same health insurance than someone with a higher wage. That meant that everybody who's in the lower half of our salary distribution had more money to take home in their pocket, while they still got the same health insurance in the year after we did that, and that's continued to be the case. So that's a very unusual structure, and it was a way of essentially having the higher paid folks carry more of the cost of the total health insurance and the premiums. So that the intention there was we couldn't raise the wage very much in that year, but we could make this other shift that tried to rebalance in a certain way. So that's the second thing. And then, as I said, in this current year that we're planning for right now, we're trying to reprioritize, come back around to the question of raising the lowest wage again, up from $11. So we're trying to make our way through step by step, doing what we can year after year on this particular issue around a living wage at the lower wages, while also providing a cost of living increases and other increases for folks in other parts of with other roles at the college as well. So trying to keep all of those things going. So that's what I have.
And if any of our other panelists wanted to take a stab at this question, or any of the other questions that have been asked so far today, Professor Sheehan?
That kind of contradictory message. On the one hand, I mean, in budgetary questions, it ends up becoming a zero-sum game. And I'm going to encourage people not to think about it that way, but that's sort of how it is. You have to make choices. And being on the strategic planning committee, other initiatives are important to the college as well. Like yesterday at the faculty meeting, we had a recommendation that we have a director for sustainability, which is important. But that's going to take a commitment of resources. So it is balancing various commitments we make. Some student supported, some come from other places. But I think at some point we have to sort of not simply think about it as a zero-sum game and look at like the direction in which we're going. I mean, if we're making progress, and I know this is not satisfying, but we have made some progress over the last couple of years, not as fast as anybody would like on lots of different issues, but on diversity and inclusion, hopefully on sustainability and on wages. I mean, but again, it takes pressure and takes constant, I mean, it takes pressure to move in that direction. But at some point, I just want to say, like, you have to sort of step back and not simply look at it as a zero-sum game, but look at the overall direction.
We have another question.
That was a lot of hands. I'll get to you.
Hi, Marco. I have a question mostly for the cabinet because, I feel like the way that it kind of, especially on the issue of living wage, a lot of the talk is kind of, oh, I wish we could pay a living wage and I wish we could do this and do that. But like, is the cabinet or is the board been thinking of kind of concrete and proper plans to achieve that minimum wage, and what are those plans looking like for now? Because we wish we could get the Scott Center, and we got it, and we wish we could get a better building and material hall, and we got it. And so I feel like if we're wishing to have a living wage for all of our employees, as we clearly there is push for that, at least from the students and from a lot of other people, how are we gonna get that wish into a reality?
So I think, I come from the fundraising side of things, right? And so we, in terms of how we talk to donors, it's really, what are the priorities of the institution, what are the values of the institution, what are we trying to achieve, and what is the programmatic impact of the gift, both from an academic perspective and from a co-curricular perspective. And so every year, through a budgeting process, we talk about what do we value, what's important, what are we working towards. And I think as the slide lines up, we are looking at how can we bring the living wage up? How can we get to a point where we get closer to reaching a living wage? But it comes at the cost of, we also want more people, more assistance for students in terms of wellness and guidance. And we want better faculty. We want not just the current faculty we have, which are excellent, but how do you sustain that when new faculty leave, and how do you give them the resources to continue to do the things they want to do in the classroom? And so a lot of times when we talk to donors, when they think about their experience, when many of our donors are alums, they think about the people that impact them, they think about the faculty who mentored them through their IS or through other ways. And so a lot of times their gifts are really earmarked to impact those programs. So when we think about how do we impact and invest in other areas of campus, that really falls into money that comes from other buckets, and then philanthropy, and then there's competing priorities, I think, as Sarah mentioned at the very beginning, our main priority is to give you an excellent experience in the classroom and outside the classroom, and so that's the top priority. So what are the other things that come in to support that, and then what comes in behind that is being important, but not as important as your experience.
Yeah, I would say, because Wayne and I have talked about this, I think to your direct question, fundraising for a living wage, which I think is what you're pointing to, right? We raise funds for the Scott Center, we raise funds for Mateer. The funds for buildings like that are not in these kind of operating. What I showed you was our operating budget year over year to, again, mostly pay salaries. If we do something special like create a new building, it has its own, because it's not an annual thing, it's kind of one time. So fundraising for salaries in general, actually even fundraising for faculty salaries, all those kinds of fundraising, they're possible, but they're much harder. Our alumni are most interested in giving to scholarships for you. They're interested in creating spaces that they know will be there in perpetuity, and scholarships, endowments that they know will be there in perpetuity. That doesn't mean that you could never raise funds, but even raising funds for faculty lines is actually quite challenging relative to scholarships, for example. So my own feeling is not that we wouldn't pursue that, but my sense is actually that if we're going to find more funds to be able to do these things more quickly, which I think is, we're sort of all talking about the same thing, but kind of how fast can we do those things? Probably a lot of the work to do that is going to need to be balancing within the resources that we have, rather than having kind of creating a lot of new resources on the top that will enable it. I could be wrong about that, but the way we've been working on it to this point has been, trying to think about how we can balance within what we have.
Questions? A reminder to anybody asking a question to just hold the mic close to your face.
And if you can't hear any of us, or we're fuzzy or holding it wrong, just tell us. That would be helpful.
Hi, so I was wondering, since we're talking about fundraising and how most of the money from that will go towards new buildings and scholarships and things for students, most of the people that are giving this money, or at least a lot of them, are alumni, and I know that they, and soon myself in our class, do care about the institution as a whole. We do care about our staff, clearly. Why is there not a push, since that is a big chunk of the budget, to ask them to support with their money instead of just the students, to support the staff?
Yeah, so I think to Sarah's point, we have to remember that when donors make a gift to the college, we have to honor what their restrictions are, right? So if we accept a gift and they want to be used to enhance this academic department, or to build this building, or to help with athletics, or whatever their passion is, and we accept a gift with those terms, we have to honor that. So in terms of, I think one of the things I've talked about with the Living Wage group in terms of how philanthropy can be helpful with living wage is the Wooster Fund. That really is the area where unrestricted support comes in every year. We budget around that. That's how we budget around. It's one of the factors we think about when it comes to increases in terms of salary and benefits and wages. It's really the area I think that donors can make the biggest push. I do know that's the Living Wage Campaign reached out to some of our alums, some of our reunion volunteers. The response was, they were supportive, but their gifts that came in subsequent to that were really restricted to things that they were passionate about and cared about. Not that they don't care about staff or faculty for that matter, they do very much. But their memories and their passions are really centered around their experiences, and sometimes that happens to be more focused on academic programs or buildings than academic programs. And so those who are passionate about it, we've received some gifts through the Wooster Fund, but it's not been a huge upswell.
Right, and I understand that you have to honor the wishes of the donors, of course. My question was, why do you, or whoever the folks are who are asking for the money and writing these letters, why are you not asking, would you support the staff, instead of give us your money and they can just label it whatever they would like, instead of actually pushing for that yourselves?
So in the Wooster Fund this year, we did introduce 5 areas of impact, and one of the areas is faculty and staff. That is an area of impact, and we have received gifts in honor of the Wooster Fund and honor faculty and staff through the Wooster Fund.
And that's
new this year.
The first time this year.
Yeah.
I can also, I don't know if Professor. Okay. My name's Leah. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Another big portion of money coming into the college is student tuition. I work minimum wage for the college. I'm working to fund my own tuition, right? I think a lot of us are. And I think that it's really hard to work alongside people who aren't able to pay their rent, who, I'm paying for something that is really important to me. My education is really important. But I don't feel like I'm living up to the values that Wooster said that they would have. And so, so my question is kind of starting the money going into net tuition, right, from us. Where that's going, I know a lot is going to staff and faculty, but how that is allocated.
Anyone who's spoken in Spanish?
Oh, yeah, everyone.
So thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate your sharing what that feels like to do, because I think that's important. So I want to understand a little bit more clearly when you talk about how that's allocated. So all of the funds that come in are sort of allocated for all of the activities we do. So it's not like tuition is allocated for this and
Right.
gifts are allocated for that, unless the gifts are specific. So I think, are you asking for sort of more detail under this picture, or I just want to make sure I'm understanding it properly?
And maybe I'm not understanding it completely, but wondering if there is a way to allocate more of students' funds, and I know it's also an issue because it's trying to get everything that we need and everything there as well. I would just argue that this is part of our quality of life, and I think while everything else is equally important. So maybe this is less of a question, more of a comment. But I think that it's all important, but I think this should be recognized not as separate from students' well-being. Another comment that I had was kind of dialogue surrounding peers. Oh shoot! Sorry, I'm not gonna yell. And kind of who's considered a peer, right? In terms of the working, and how who's considered a peer and who's considered worthy of a living wage. Everyone is, but I don't see that in action, and I kind of see a kind of tiered response, and again, this could be completely wrong, but kind of faculty, administration, hourly staff, as seen as, the peers here, right, because faculty, administration, and then kind of just
seeing as a different level. So this is just me kind of stream of consciousness, but I'm wondering if anyone, including Monet, had kind of thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I would agree with you. I feel like when we're having these discussions, there's sort of like a hierarchical, I don't know if I'm saying the word. Yes, sort of system. So we're talking about the administration, who are obviously being paid fairly well. And then following that, we have the faculty, and then following that, we'll have the hourly paid staff in addition to students. And if we're talking about how we want students to strive for an equitable, just world, like we need to make sure that we're not prioritizing any other sort of job, over the other. Because if we think about it, like this past semester, the weather was awful. There was lots of snow and ice.
Grounds curling?
And exactly, like who do you think was waking up at like 5 o'clock or earlier and shoveling and icing the sidewalks? It was our grounds crew that has worked endlessly and tirelessly throughout this entire semester. And who do you think woke up early to make sure that we had hot food on our plates, to have the opportunity to have a meal? And I'm not saying that administration is important, because you all are, but we need to definitely make sure that those who are such a fundamental part of our campus functioning to be able to survive at the absolute bare minimum without any assistance or having to work more than a full-time job. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but I completely agree with you. We shouldn't see any job higher than the other. All jobs are important. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to say.
Yeah, not so much a question as a comment.
Just hold the microphone close to you.
Not a question, but a comment. I've been here a lot of years. I wasn't here for the Old Main fire, but not too long after that. I can tell you that, in fact, none of this conversation was going on 5 years ago. This conversation is only going on because the Living Wage Group, and the support of all you who supported Living Wage, you are the people that put this in motion. I think our current administration is wonderful in picking up sensitivity to this issue and responding to you. But if you ever get discouraged, understand that 5 years ago, minimum wage here was $8.50 an hour. It's now 11 and going up. And a lot of that's due to the pressure you put on and the questions you raised and the good work you've done providing budgeting. I just encourage you to keep up the good work. And as President Bolton said, I think you're doing a wonderful job of fulfilling that last graduation requirement on civic responsibility.
There was one over here earlier that I didn't get to, and I want to make sure that I get to it. Okay. Just kind of going back to the fundraising thing, you said that there's now kind of a category of like supporting the staff. Does that mean that people can donate directly to that area of like our of our spending?
Right, so we spent $59 million in compensation, if I remember correctly. We raised $3.5 million a year for the Wooster Fund. So the areas of impact, which includes faculty and staff support, very much goes towards the budget, which goes towards faculty and staff compensation. So if alums or students, some students have been involved with Giving Woo Day and other things on campus, want to make a gift earmarked through Wooster Fund for that, they can. And that's nothing we just started this summer.
Okay, one concern that like just kind of comes up naturally is that even if there are donations that are made directly towards this area, when the overall considerations are being made, those donations might come into that consideration as like, okay, so you have your big pot and you're divvying it up, and you might consider the donations that were directly made as a part of that whole pot anyway. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this correctly.
You mean, you're saying it would be budget relief versus budget?
Yeah. So like, is it going to actually have an impact on how much money is put towards that area?
Well, I don't know. You're the expert.
I'll let you talk.
I imagine a class could create a gift for a living wage, right? And even do a matching campaign, right? I mean, so it wouldn't just be one class, right? But you could start fund, I can imagine, right? I mean, and then see how it goes, right? But you could challenge other alum, challenge faculty to contribute, and start that process, and that could be a category, I imagine. I don't want to throw this all back on students and alum, right? But I mean, to get something started, and that, I think that'd be possible.
What I have said to some of the student leaders with living wage is it's $50,000 to start an endowment. If a class or individual wanted to raise $50,000 to get an endowment earmarked for staff wages going, we'd be open to that. I think to your earlier comment or question or concern maybe about is it budget relief versus budget enhancing. Again, when you're talking about a $59 million budget just for compensation, what we've raised so far for faculty and staff compensation through the Wooster Fund it's not enough to move the needle one way or the other. It's not going to say, when we sit around the table, we don't look at, well, how much came in for the Wooster Fund for faculty and staff. We don't think about that at all. We're thinking about the things that Sarah said, which is what's the right thing to do, what can we afford to do in line with all the other priorities we have, which again follows the filter by which we make decisions is what's best for the students from an academic and co-curricular perspective. And knowing that staff play a major role in that, but we also don't want to do things that I think in a lot of ways would come at the expense of the experience. So we have to weigh these things out. But to your concern, it's not enough of a factor at this point to sway that.
So I was just going to say, as a kind of compliment maybe to those two things, so if you have to think a little bit too about continuity, right? So there's two kinds of gifts. So the Wooster Fund, those gifts that come in, we spend them that year, right? So if there's a big wave of funds that come in and we raise people's salaries using that big wave of funds, let's just assume that for a minute, we would have to know that we could maintain it year after year. So these compensation commitments are ones that are ongoing, right? And you want to be able to, some of you I've talked to about various questions and concerns, so this is part of why I don't make a promise unless I know I can make it, because we're going to make those changes. We need to be sure we're really going to be able to sustain them. So the Wooster Fund is great for the given year, and it really can make things possible. The kind of other gift that Dr. Tierney was talking about and that Wayne then was following up on about an endowment where let's say you gather a certain amount of money and you invest it in the endowment. Those are the gifts that do work in perpetuity, right? So we only are spending 5% of that gift each year, but we're committed to spending that 5% every year forever. And so it's different ways of doing it, has different impacts. So sometimes people want to give to the Wooster Fund because they know that money will go to work right away. And sometimes people want to give an endowment because they know that money will be there doing that particular work for which it was designated and named, and it can only be used for that forever, but only 5% at a time. So it's just two different ways to think about it.
I believe we have two questions in the back.
Hi, I'm Maureen. There's been a lot of talk tonight about using the budget to better the student experience and do things that will improve students' lives while they're here. But I guess I'm curious on how exactly has the administration been determining what is improving students' lives? Because I would say we're all here and there's a lot of people who cannot be here tonight who are saying what would improve our experience is having a living wage for our workers. But there have been a lot of things that the school has done that I would say are not improving students' experience at all. I'm just curious how these things happen. Just for one example of, I would say, many, Kittredge got renovated this year, but students can't even use Kittredge as a space anymore, really. So it's these different things, that's just one example. But how exactly has the administration been determining, what students want when, I would say, I don't feel like students' voices are really being heard.
Thank you. That's a great question and a really large one. So I'll try to answer it succinctly. So one of the things that happens in our prioritizing work in the Strategic Planning and Priorities Advisory Committee is that periodically, not every year, but many years, that committee goes to SGA and talks to students about what they're most urgently looking for. So the priorities that we've baked in over the past couple of years, increasing the number of counselors, for example, bringing a chief diversity officer, enhancing some certain kinds of spaces, bringing faculty in new areas of study, creating new majors. Those things are coming through a variety of conversations that happen with SGA, conversations that happen with different student groups over time, conversations that came through the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategic Plan, which Drew was, a third of the people on that committee were students and worked very closely with students around their needs and goals. So there are a lot of different routes by which various ideas are brought to us about students' priorities, and Dr. Tierney can talk about this too, that we're reaching out to try to draw that information in over time. There are many things that students are looking for in different ways, and then many things that we also just need to do if there are buildings that are crumbling or pieces that are need worked on over time. So there's a lot of ways that information comes, but SPAC is one of the key ways. We also hear, for example, from the provost who works with academic departments, we hear in that way about academic interests that students have, areas they'd like us to cover in the curriculum, that comes in that way. The dean of students and his team who are there working on all different kinds of things tell us things like, what dorms need to be renovated or what spaces need improved and those kinds of things. So it comes to us in a lot of ways, but I certainly understand not every decision of something that we fund is something that affects every student's life, but we try to make the right set over time.
So, I had a question regarding prioritizing funds as well as prioritizing positions and allocating them to which employees. So I was wondering, to what extent are calculations being taken into account as to what positions are designated for students and what positions are designated for staff hired outside of the student body? Because obviously, if you hire a student, the college can afford to pay them less, and then that could free up more money to afford a living wage for other employees. So positions with minimum qualifications that take less training for students might be able to free up funds for employees that have been with the college for longer and would benefit from a living wage, obviously.
So that's a great question. I don't know that we have an overall philosophy, but I think you're suggesting that if we had more work that was done by student employees, then there would be more other kinds of roles done by professional employees. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, so other people may have other things to say here. I think those are always important questions. We do ask ourselves, is there a place, let's say a position is vacated for some reason and in a place where maybe sometimes students have done certain parts of a role, maybe perhaps staff have done another part of the role. We think about where are students willing and able to step up, where are the needs for training ones that someone could appropriately, quickly learn to do the job, where does it work well to have someone doing, or a group of students doing something 5 or 8 or 10 or 15 hours a week versus having someone employed full-time on the kinds of expertise that need to be developed. But you're right, there are students doing a lot of important work across the campus, and we try to think about doing that appropriately and also think about the kind of work that students want to do. What are the roles that they're wanting to step into? So there's a mix of things there.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that question? Looks like we have another question.
So to the best of my understanding, with Ruth Williams, there was someone who started the fund, but then, to the best of my understanding, the school continued to ask people for gifts, and large gifts, because it's an expensive haul. Why are we not being as aggressive with an issue that is so important to the student body? And we talk about, we can put it out there for someone to donate to this cost, but why are we not being more aggressive when we're making plans like creating a new Lowry that is going to make the lives of especially the staff in food service so much more stressful as there's construction, as they're doing their work? Why are we not putting the intention on paying them a living wage when we're only going to make their jobs harder with money that we are asking for? to do these larger projects?
Thank you so much. So I want to take that in two pieces. So actually one of the first things that is most important, but a lot of the urgency around Lowry, is how hard it is to work in our dining hall right now. Our dining hall was designed for 2/3 as many students as we have. And so the spaces in the back for the kitchens are really, really hard to work in. So actually we've talked really strongly, I'd say intensively with our trustees about one of the most important things about a Lowry renovation is making a space that's easier for dining staff to work in. And the leadership of Marjorie and her team, as we think about that, has been, that's actually a really critical piece, and we can't make that a better place to work without a significant investment in the building. So it's definitely also for students, but students, many of the students here will have graduated by the time we have a Lowry renovation. We hope that many of the staff will be here to see it, as will students of the next generation. So that's actually really a primary component of our thinking about Lowry as a whole. That doesn't mean that the construction itself won't be stressful, because it will be if we are able to do it, but that's actually really important. You've raised a really important question there, which is the experience of people working in these spaces. So, you know, I think your other question is about the fundraising and kind of how can we think about fundraising. So I'll maybe say something about the life sciences, and I'll pass to Wayne. You know, the kind of sequence of events with the life sciences building was that the old building was really crumbling. It was impossible to teach life sciences in there in any kind of reasonable way. I understand. It was taken down before I got here, right? But this is what I understand from people. That it really wasn't workable as a teaching space, as a learning space. And so that became a priority. And then there was one major gift made, and then another major gift made, and then to get it completed without having it increase or take up a larger chunk of the annual budget, the goal was to have more gifts to come in to pay it off, so there wouldn't have to be debt and debt payments. So that was the goal, was to try to meet those needs, meet those curricular needs from a building that was really crumbling. Again, I wasn't in its old state, but that was my understanding, and then to try to get it done efficiently. But I think your question again is sort of, can we fundraise? Your question is, can we fundraise more thoroughly, more vigorously around wages? Is that right? So I don't know.
Yeah. We had a session like this in the fall, and I said at that session, hear me out, let me finish my comment before we react. But if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority, right? So when you're fundraising, you have to figure out what are the things that are really going to move the needle for the institution. And so those are the things you talk about with donors. So whether it be a new building or some programmatic support, I would argue that as we crafted the new areas of impact within the Wooster Fund, adding the faculty and staff support dimension was saying that that's a priority. Now, I will tell you, donors are going to, at the end of the day, voters vote with their checkbook. You can lay out 5, 6, 7 priorities and say these are things that are really important to the institution. They're going to support the thing that resonates most with them personally, and it can vary for a lot of reasons. Why they choose scholarships versus a building, or a building versus scholarships, has a lot of dimensions that we really, frankly, at the end of the day, don't have any control over. We can certainly push and control and suggest, but you know, donors will fund what they're interested in. Of course, then we have to decide if it comes to restrictions, that can we live with those restrictions or not. But I would say that because what we've done recently with the Wooster Fund, I would say that we have made that a priority.
So the one other thing I would just say about salaries, and this is almost cultural, but I would say that alumni in general think that you know, our staff is hundreds of people and our faculty is hundreds of people. And overall, I think our alumni probably appropriately think it's our responsibility within the regular budget of the college to compensate people appropriately, to find the regular resources that we have all the time and use those for the compensation of folks as a whole. So very occasionally someone will give us a gift to fund a particular position. Like, okay, we think this is a position we really want you to have, like a professorship here or a new staff position there, and someone will give a gift to fund that position. And so that, but to give a gift to spread over the wages of the entire set of employees, in general, that folks think of that as kind of our responsibility to figure out how to do that with the the regular money that comes in from tuition fees. Would it be helpful if someone gave us a big gift? Of course, absolutely, it's something we could talk about, but it's not, ordinarily people are giving, if they're giving around a staff or a faculty, they're giving around a particular position and not sort of all of the hundreds of people who are engaged in a particular work. And that doesn't mean that that work is not important. Of course, it's critically important, but it's sort of the way that philanthropy tends to work. For that, and then even for scholarships, people are thinking of a scholarship, not scholarships for all of the students. So it's a little bit about how that rolled out.
We got a question in the middle over here.
So I think you're right that a lot of people would say that it is the administration and the institution's responsibility itself to be able to pay its workers appropriately, and that a lot of this conversation has been focused around philanthropy and relying on the philanthropy of our donors, of alumni, etc., to be able to make up those costs and pay workers a living wage. And I think you in the middle, sorry I didn't get your name, but you commented that if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority, and that you as an institution try to choose the things that is going to push the needle and make the institution better in the long run, etc. I think it is a very strong argument to say that paying your hourly workers a living wage will better the institution in the long run and push that needle in the best way possible, especially even looking at staff retention rates and how staff here, workers in the city of Worcester will move elsewhere because they get better wages elsewhere. So you're right that it is the responsibility of the institution itself and not just a reliance on philanthropy that can't be counted on to be replicable and to go on, year by year. So I guess my question is, instead of focusing the conversation all about philanthropy in its various forms, whether it's the Wooster Fund, whether it's an endowment, et cetera, if we can refocus the conversation on looking at how the budget is already divvied up and where there are some, I know, there's always an argument for, there are never any extra funds laying around, but also if we are using donations for new buildings, for all these other things, and those are coming in and we have enough for those larger expenses, that why can't we prioritize the responsibility of the institution just in general, flat out, to pay workers an acceptable rate, which I think we would all argue is a living wage.
Yeah, you may as well come in.
I think it's more of a comment. I mean, it's the right question to ask, but that's why I put that back up there, but that's what we're trying to do.
I think we have time for one more question, and I know you had a question in the back. I saw your hand first.
So Ben kind of touched on this just a moment ago, specifically talking about staff retention rates. I know that it's been a while since that fall demonstration, but a lot of what we heard from the staff during that demonstration was that we are understaffed. We occasionally hear from the college that we're understaffed. And kind of with a focus on wage, I think kind of an explanation for why that is would actually help aid in this conversation as well. I think that's a factor that we also need to be touching on a little bit more. Can any of you say anything about that?
It's my last chance to say something. And the mic broke. Can you hear me? So I think the first item on this list is raising the lowest wage. So that's a budget priority for this year. I will say a couple of things. I think it's now public. We have, under President Bolton's direction, increased and came up with a shift differential for our hourly wages in dining, because getting people to work on the weekends and work till 2 a.m. at Mom's has been difficult. And so we're hoping that shift differential, I have to say that very carefully, Come on, that was funny. Come on. All right. Is one of the things we've done. We also did a one-time, to some of the comments when we have temporary money versus ongoing money, what we talked about with the gift, whether it's an endowment or whatever. We had some one-time money saved up this year. Because we had so much turnover in dining, we gave everybody last fall a $500 bonus because we wanted to make sure that people recognized the hard work that they did. But that only can be done once because we aren't going to have that savings every year, right? That's the whole point of the gift, the annual gift versus that. So we are committed to these hourly people. I have the privilege of leading this division that has the most hourly people with custodian, grounds, and dining in it. And so they're hardworking people. We are committed to making them, and they are a very valued part of our family. And it takes all of us to make this place work, not any one person or any one thing. So I can tell you, as someone who's worked in higher education for 35 years, okay, your response is, he doesn't look old enough to work in 35 years, right? That's another funny thing, right? I've never seen an institution, actually, in that time of my tenure that has dedicated so much for equity. And by that I mean, you heard earlier, I don't know if you really focused on it, we actually tax the higher paid employees to help subsidize the lower paid employees so they can keep the same level of benefits. I don't know of any other school that does that in the Great Lakes or in the Ohio 5. So that's pretty impressive, and so I think that's because of all the work, as was said earlier, that you all have done. Sending us the signal, but I'm going to guess every person in this room got some financial. Who didn't get financial aid? And nobody raised their hand. So, but I mean, I guess the point being is there's so many priorities facing us as an institution, and we are listening, and you can see the priorities right here as number one is raising the lowest wage.
So thank you all so much for your questions. So what's going to happen now, we're just going to offer just a brief closing statement if any of you would like to give one, and then I'll just say a little stuff on behalf of Living Wage.
Well, thank you all for coming out. And I know that there was a comment made earlier about feeling like the administration doesn't hear you. And I would like to encourage everyone to get involved and put pressure on those who are in student government, such as SGA or Campus Council, and be sure to continually support the Living Wage because these are definitely organizations that have the opportunity to interact with administration, the Board of Trustees throughout the year, especially those who are donating lots of money. And so if you're graduating soon, consider donating money to the faculty and support section of like the Wooster Fund or starting your own endowment or something like that if you're able to. But we definitely should continually put pressure on the administration, on the college, on each other to make sure that our hourly paid staff members are going to have an equitable living wage. So I hope no one loses hope and continues to fight this good fight.
Thank you. And so finally, I'm just going to say a few things on the behalf of the Living Wage campaign. First, thank you all so much for coming out here, and thank you so much to our 6 panelists who answered everybody's questions. The goal of this event for a lot of us was to establish greater transparency between the students and the staff and the administration and the faculty. And I think in many ways we accomplished that tonight. And I would like to say, adding on to what Monet said, that if you would like to get involved more, Living Wage Campaign meets every Sunday at 1:00 p.m. in the back room in Lowry, and it sounds like a lot of you have some really great ideas about ways that we can work toward living wages, and we'd love to hear them. There is, of course, the other what am I looking for? Pillar of our organization, which is Staff Respect. We hold staff appreciation events, and we'd also like to hear perspectives from students and staff and students who work at this college for how we can improve those events and really bridge the gap more between the students and the staff. And yeah, we do currently have our letter writing campaign, and we appreciate all of who have been involved in that so far. And we'd encourage anybody who hasn't already to write a letter to the board or to President Bolton. And just a final thank you so much to everybody, and just that the conversation does not end here. We still have a long way to go. So thank you so much.
Environmental. So you